Hello, everyone. My name is Deanna Schreiber-Gregory, and my presentation is on A Doctor's Dilemma, How Propensity Scores Can Help Control for Selection Bias in Medical Education. Here's my bio. I won't go into any detail about that. You can always read it later. So this is an overview of the presentation, so you can jump to any point in it if you'd like. However, I do recommend listening to it in its entirety. So first, I'm going to go over an introduction to propensity scores for those of us that aren't really familiar with what this type of analysis is. I'm then going to talk about the current study breakdown, so what this study in particular is about, and what the question is and what the variables look like. We're then going to talk about propensity score creation, how to create a propensity score, and then we're going to go into, after creating it, what kind of analytic methods we can use with a propensity score. We're then going to wrap it up by looking at the different model comparisons. So we're going to look at each of the different analyses and compare how they performed against our original model. And then we're going to have a conclusion, summary, and a wrap-up. Okay, so I'll begin with the introduction. So propensity scores. As we know, there are two main types of research methods. So we have randomized controlled trials and observational studies. An advantage of randomized controlled trials is that they have randomization, which is great because we can actually get more of a causal relationship out of a type of study that has randomization. Observational studies, on the other hand, they don't have that advantage of having randomization because a lot of them you can't actually randomize people into different groups for ethical or just feasibility reasons. One thing that they do have, though, is generalizability. So because we're observing people in their actual environment or observing the effects in their actual environment, we can actually get a little bit better generalizability out of these types of studies. The problem with having a study that doesn't have randomization, like I mentioned earlier, is that we aren't really able to pull causation from these studies, which can result, which in essence can result in like a selection bias. So we're not able to say that we have equal types of groups in our different treatment groups. They can have their own little quirks or relationships within those groups that kind of make them more a part of those groups. So when we do have this issue, we can use a variety of different statistical techniques to help control or to help with the fact that we're not able to control for randomization. Some of these techniques that can account for these differences are matching, stratification, and regression adjustment techniques. This can be limited, though, in use of these techniques if you have too few covariates in the adjustment. Propensity scores is one way that you could utilize these techniques. A conditional probability of being treated or included in a particular group based on identified covariates is what makes up their propensity score. Propensity scores also do a great job of accounting for imbalances within the different treatment groups, which tends to resemble randomization. It's basically kind of called like a pseudo-randomization technique. And then in essence, what a propensity score ends up doing is summarizes the covariate effects into one score that you can then add back into the model to help control for that lack of randomization. All right, one thing to note is that even with propensity scores, we do have a set of assumptions that must be supported or must be present within the model before we're able to use a propensity score analysis. These assumptions are the stable unit treatment value assumption, positivity, and unconfoundedness. Once we have these assumptions met, and so you've tested for these assumptions and you've determined that these assumptions have been met, then a propensity score can be used as that balancing score. If these assumptions are not met, I don't recommend using propensity scores within the model because, of course, you probably would get a result that is not consistent with what the propensity score usage would be intended to do. So please just test for these assumptions, and then, if they're right, then you can move on to actually creating and utilizing propensity score. Okay, so the creation of a propensity score is actually very easy. It can be created in two steps. The first step is to calculate the propensity score as the probability of a patient or participant inclusion in a specific group. That can be done through several different methods. One of the most popular is through ProcLogistic. And then once you've created that score, just include it in your model through one of the techniques that we'll discuss in today's presentation. The method of logistic procedure and the creation of propensity scores, like I said, is one of the most popular ways of doing it. The logistic model itself provides a description of the relationship between the variables, which allows for us to create that propensity score. Logistic regression is then used to predict the probability of an event occurring and then pushes that out into a variable, which we can use within the model. If you don't want to use the logistic procedure, there are a couple of alternatives to using or to creating and utilizing propensity scores. That would be through the proc-gen-mod procedure using the output statement and predicted keyword. There's also the PS match procedure, which is very new. The reason I don't use that procedure in particular in our model, I do talk about it in the paper and how it's set up, but in this presentation, I don't talk about it because for my particular version of SAS, I really didn't have access to it. So I wanted to be sensitive to people who might not have access to it and provide this alternative way, which, all of us should be able to do. All right, so now that we've gotten a good introduction and how to create the propensity scores, we're going to talk about our current study. So this study, I want to state again that it does not use real data, but it is based on analysis of real data from US medical schools. And the structure, the specific structure of courses that one US medical school in particular uses. The data was constructed to represent about 5 years of medical student data. The reason I didn't use real data, actually I have a lot of reasons for it, but the main one is that I wanted to protect the identity of the students and the implications of this particular analysis. Since this is a theoretical exploration that was going to be put online and presented at a conference, I wanted to make sure that it was strictly just theoretical. I didn't want anyone pulling any actual meaning from it. I just wanted to perform this analysis to make sure that it was feasible for me to use propensity scores within the question that I had. I didn't want to use the real data to do that. So I created my data based on real data and then ran my analyses just to see how it would look. So that's why none of this is real data, but it's very close to real data. It's using the same boundaries and pretty much the same structure. Okay, so I have a couple of research questions that I wanted to look at for this particular study. The first one is to explore the possibility of a connection between the sequence one chooses for their clerkship year of medical school and the resulting grades they obtain on major examinations, specifically the big examinations of the USMLE Step 1 and Step 2 CK. A secondary goal of this presentation in the study is to explore the possibilities and complications of utilizing a propensity score analysis to control for selection bias in an observational education data set. Those of us that work in medical education or education in particular know that it's very difficult to separate individuals into groups, especially with something as sensitive as choosing your medical school trajectory. So I wanted to just see if this was even feasible or able to be used in this type of study. Okay, the biggest selection bias concern that we have for this particular study, and the reason I thought propensity scores would help correct for it, is that the sequence in which a student goes through their clerkship year of medical school is extremely difficult to assign. I think maybe for every medical school, I'm not going to say that as a blanket statement, but most medical schools, at least at this time, you're able to choose the sequence in which you go through your clerkship. So basically which of the specialties you are able to study first and the order in which you're able to study those. That is more up to the student than it really is to the school. So you're not able to have randomization in this type of environment. There's also been a lot of speculation about the effect of clerkship order on NBME and USMLE performance. Mainly, does completing a certain specialty like internal medicine before you're a more seemingly more complicated specialty such as surgery, could that help you score higher on maybe a surgery clerkship or the surgery clerkship examinations or the USMLE examination? So does having that kind of compound route through your medical education experience in clerkship, does that actually help you score better on on your examinations? Or, is there one sequence that maybe gives you a handicap over another? It's just a thought. Other factors that may be responsible for why a student would choose a certain clerkship over another, or clerkship order over another. There are several different reasons a student could do that. One of them could be They might have decided on their concentration, so maybe they, are like, hey, I want to go into surgery, so I want to save that one for last, or I want to do surgery first to get it out of the way. So there's maybe having that choice of what you want to do after you graduate could be something that impacts the student's choice as to which clerkship order they choose. Another one would be maybe they want to delay a clerkship for later in the year because maybe they deem it or think of it as more difficult, or there's certain aspects of it that make them nervous, or they think that, if I complete one clerkship over another before I do the other one, it'll make that one a little bit easier. Lots of different ways lots of different things that could go through a student's mind when choosing their clerkship order. So we wanted to just consider those in the creation of this kind of a study, or in looking at this kind of a study. These factors could also contribute to the likelihood of USMLE performance. So maybe if a student was struggling in surgery-related activities, so they saved that one for their last clerkship in their sequence, maybe they're a struggling student overall, so that could also contribute to their USMLE performance. There's lots of speculations, just lots of thoughts that kind of go into a study like this, which is what makes medical education such an interesting and complex study design. So that's why we wanted to see if the propensity scores could help with something like this. Okay, so the variables that are in this study, the outcome variables that I chose were USMLE Step 1 and Step 2 CK performance. I chose the scores themselves, not just the pass-fail reports. The independent variables for the predictor of interest I chose was clerkship sequence, because I wanted to see if clerkship sequence itself did have an effect on the outcome while controlling for covariates such as pre-clerkship variables like pre-clerkship NBME scores, location restrictions, MCAT score, college science GPA, age at admissions, gender, and class year. And then, of course, the other covariates I wanted to choose were those that happen during the clerkship time frame alongside clerkship sequence, and that would be the clerkship NBME exam scores. Those clerkship NBME exam scores could also serve as their own outcome, but that could be another study. For now, we're just mainly looking at the USMLE Step 1 and Step 2 CK. In this presentation, I'm going to concentrate on Step 1. All right, so this is one of the complicated parts in the variable creation. So this is what the different clerkships look like. So on the left-hand side, you see the different rounds. There are 9 different rounds that you can choose from, or that the student can assign or get a specialty in. So we've got 2 internal medicine specialty rounds, which would be ward and ambulatory. We have psychiatry, 2 surgery ones, general and specialty, obstetrics and gynecology, family medicine, and pediatrics. Now, you can see the numbers I have there, 1, 2, 3, 4 through 9. That is the order in which you would take that certain specialty. So maybe psychiatry for one student was their 5th clerkship round, where maybe for another student it was their 9th clerkship round. So that's what those numbers mean. So when I looked at that variable in particular or the values for each of those different variables, I got one of those numbers. The next column, so the middle column you'll see is block. The clerkships themselves are actually paired. Internal and psychiatry are together. Surgery and obstetrics and gynecology are together. Family medicine and pediatrics are together. What this means is that when you look at the different rounds, internal medicine and psych will always be around each other. So you'll only see a combination of those 3 kind of being switched within each other. So you might have ward ambulatory psychiatry or psychiatry ward ambulatory, any of those combinations. But you'll never see surgery, OB-GYN, family medicine, or pediatrics in between those different concentrations because you do them kind of in the same block. And then, of course, surgery and obstetrics gynecology are done in the same block. Family medicine, pediatrics are done in the same block. For those variables, I see different values such as the 1, 2, 3. So is it the first block? Is it the second block? Or is it the third block? The sequence variable that I created, I could have done it in several different ways. I could have actually went and looked at each of the different rounds and how they compare to the blocks and created like a ton of different values that represented that. Because there are so many different results that could have came from that, I decided to try to make it as simple as possible and concentrate on the order of the blocks. So did the student do their internal medicine psychiatry block first? Or did they do their surgery block first, or their family medicine block first, and then which one did they do second, which one did they do third? So I ended up having 6 different groups, sorry, instead of, I can't think of the number off the top of my head, a number of groups that would have came from if I had actually taken into consideration round and block in the creation of a sequence. So this was just one example. For the propensity score, I needed to have them ordered. So what I did was I assumed for this, like I said, theoretical exploration, I assumed that ideally you would want surgery and obstetrics and gynecology to be your last in the last block because, like, theoretically they may be the most complicated and benefit the most from having the other 2 blocks in front of it. I then chose to have internal medicine and psychiatry be the second block, with the assumption that having internal medicine as close to surgery as possible would be the most beneficial, which left family medicine and pediatrics to be the first block that a student would go through. So they would first go through family medicine, pediatrics, then internal medicine and psychiatry, with the result of surgery and obstetrics and gynecology. And then, of course, the rest of them behind it kind of fell in order as to how far in surgery and obstetrics was, and internal medicine and psychiatry. Okay. All right, so the propensity scores I wanted to create for this particular study, my treatment groups were the clerkship sequence, and I wanted to balance these treatment groups so as to reduce the bias to group selection and obtain a better idea of the effect of the clerkship sequence on USMLE performance. So I wanted to see how my covariates were affecting my clerkship sequence and make sure that that was appropriately handled when looking at its effect on USMLE performance. One thing that I ran into was that I had a lot of continuous variables in my model. So when I was looking at my explorative statistics, it was very difficult to just in looking at them graphically and everything to have them as continuous variables. So I chose to do some binning. So I used high performance binning procedures to kind of bin the continuous variables when I needed to into different just kind of groups, which made the exploratory analyses a little bit easier, both visually and conceptually, and also when exploring the effect on propensity score analysis, I was able, having them binned in that manner was making it easier for me to do it that way as well. And then what I did through the binning procedure is I employed each of the different methods, so bucket, Winsorized, and pseudo-quantile, and chose bucket. So that's a completely different analysis and thought process that I won't cover in this other than this is what I did, but always happy to talk about it if you have questions. All right, so before I created the propensity score, I wanted to first see how my original model would perform without it. So I ran 2 different procedures. One was PROC-GLM select, simply because of the sheer number of covariates and variables that I was having in the model. I wanted to just throw this out there that, if you have several different variables, it might be a good idea to narrow them down through like a GLM select or other procedure so that you don't have as many in there, because that will affect the fit of your model. Next, you see my PROC logistic procedure, where I just ran the model as is, keeping all the variables in there since, like I said, it's theoretical, so that I can see exactly how that model without propensity score analysis would perform. I'm almost out of time. Okay, so this is my results for the initial study. And then here's my creation. So I wanted to create my propensity scores to represent the effect of my covariates on the propensity score analysis, on my sequence and the probability of falling into a certain sequence group. So I did that through the PROC logistic procedure using out into all-propen data set, and prob was the propensity scores. I then did PROC univariate to pull up the histograms, and I could see that when I created my propensity scores, they were all pretty evenly distributed. A simple regression adjustment would be just to add the propensity score itself into the model as a covariate. And then you could do a weighted one where you can add it in as a weight. Stratification would be creating a strata, which you can see you can do through the rank procedure, and then putting it back into logistic regression as a strata. Here's the results. Matching I didn't do for this one simply because I had 6 different groups I needed to match into, and that I knew wasn't going to happen. So I chose to skip that for now, but then I wanted to touch on it briefly that this is a possibility you could do, is through matching. Okay. And then here is my model comparison. So you see my original model was actually the best fit model. So having the propensity score analysis the way that I had structured it initially actually didn't really help my model a lot. It actually put in more noise than it needed to. Plus, it didn't actually adjust my R-squared any positive light, with the exception of weighted, which jumped it up to 98%. And that I don't really trust, so I'd want to go back and look at it. But both simple and stratified, the R-squared looked very close to the original one, and the model fits were still much worse. So I want to go back to the drawing board and make sure that the way I had the groups and everything structured and how I did my propensity score analysis would probably want to be revisited, so it wasn't as easy as I initially thought it might be. But like I said, it's a theoretical exploration. So one thing I wanted to consider was that I could have had too many covariates in it, the structure of my groups, the structure of my covariates, all these different things I need to go back and consider if I want to continue looking at propensity score analyses, which I do. I think it actually could have helped my model significantly. Another thing I want to consider is that the goodness of fit tests and R-squared tests that I chose aren't always the best tests. I could look at doing it a different way and maybe seeing if there is more of a difference between the different propensity score utilizations than I might be seeing by using the defaults. So in conclusion, I apologize for the speed of the last part, but there are several different ways to do propensity scores, such as regression adjustment, stratification, and matching. By utilizing propensity scores, you could help reduce your selection bias. Lots of different things you'd want to consider in that, such as the structure of your variables. And you also need to consider the theoretical nuances of your data and models, such as mine was medical education. If you have a different type of a field, you want to consider what implications the different variables and structures could have on propensity score analysis. Also, make sure that you're comparing your models on things such as goodness of fit and R-squared to make sure that propensity score analysis is actually helping your model and not making it more complicated or adding noise like I found in mine. Okay, so our question was controlling for the possible confounding effect of sequence, and it ended up not really improving the model for this example, but like I said, I'll go back and look at different ways of structuring it and talk with my fellow researchers and everything to see if maybe I had approached the question wrong or I could approach it differently. Right, here are some references I just wanted to add on here if you have an interest in propensity score analysis. I reckon there's lots of different things out there that you can look at. And I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in. Here's my contact information if you have any questions or would like to bounce off the ideas off of me or anything like that. I would love to talk more about it. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and I hope you have a wonderful day.